All right, welcome to section one. In this section, we're going to talk about some foundational blockchain ideas. We're going to talk about what blockchain is, how it all got started. We'll talk at a very high level about how it works, and we'll lay down some of the ideas that will set the stage for later conversations. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start off talking about what is blockchain. Start with the beginning. So, if you've spent any time investigating blockchain, doing any reading, or educating yourself, you've probably come across this term decentralized ledger, or this acronym DLT, decentralized ledger technology, pretty early on. And we say that blockchain is just a special type of decentralized ledger. And you'll oftentimes hear this as a distributed ledger as well. A little bit later, we'll talk about some of the technical differences between these terms, decentralized and distributed. But for right now, you can just view them as synonymous. And anytime we talk about a ledger in the blockchain world, we're really just talking about a record of stuff, any kind of stuff we care about and we want to keep track of. And traditionally, when we hear this word ledger, we think of something with financial implications, some kind of record of financial transactions. But when we use this term in the blockchain world, we use it much more generically. And the records we could be keeping, those might be records of financial transactions, or we might be keeping records of non-financial things. How are people voting in an election? What was the weather like over the past few days? Did my local sports team win or lose the last game? And what were the player statistics? So anything that we want to keep track of, any information that we care about, we can manage on a ledger. If you're coming at blockchain from more of a technical background, you might want to, anytime you hear the word ledger come up in a blockchain conversation, just substitute the word log in your head. Think about a system log or a diagnostic log. And you're actually much closer to the idea of what a blockchain ledger truly is. Another thing to keep in mind is that blockchain is just a protocol. It's just a set of rules that everyone has agreed upon and everyone's following the same rules. All the nodes or participants on a network are just following a common set of rules. And we have protocols all around us in the world. Think about the traffic laws where you live. There's a certain side of the road that you're supposed to drive on. There are certain areas where speed is expected, maybe on a highway or freeway, and other areas in a neighborhood or by a school where low speed is expected. And the only reason that traffic works in any crowded city is because everyone has agreed to follow the same protocol, the same set of rules. Now, those rules differ slightly in different parts of the world. In some parts of the world, you're supposed to drive on the left-hand side of the road. In other parts of the world, you drive on the right-hand side of the road. Well, blockchain is no different. Every blockchain platform is just a protocol. It's its own unique set of rules. And there are small variations and differences between these rule sets and approaches. But at a high level, they look very, very similar. All right. To kind of expand our conversation a little bit, blockchain is one technology, one component technology in a group or suite of technologies that we commonly refer to as Web 3.0. And so you'll hear other technologies like IoT, the Internet of Things, artificial reality or virtual reality, artificial intelligence and big data, analytics, all different emerging technologies under this Web 3.0 branch. But to really understand what Web 3.0 means and why all this is significant, let's back up and let's talk about what were Web 1.0 and 2.0 all about. So all this web generation is talking about how the internet has aged and evolved. and the new revelations or generations of technology that have been birthed through the internet. So all this starts obviously with Web 1.0. And this is really the birth of the internet. And Web 1.0 represented a decentralization or a democratization of content publishing. Imagine that you're a writer. You like to write short stories. Well, if you were doing this in the era before the internet and you wanted to share your work with others, you had to go find a publisher. You had to go find a centralized resource. And if that publisher agreed that you wrote a good story, well, then they would print up many copies and distribute those copies for sale all around the world. But whether or not anyone on the other side of the world got to read your story depended on whether or not you were accepted by that central authority or that gatekeeper. And the birth of the internet changed all of this. Suddenly, anybody could share content with anybody else anywhere in the world at any time. You did not need to go through those central publishers. You did not need to get their approval for your work to be widely distributed. And so in this era, we really see the birth of the personal homepage, and sites like GeoCities spring up. This word homepage used to refer to not what it refers to today, just the top level page on a site, but it used to truly be somebody's home on the web, a very personal place where people would share their interests and ideas and thoughts and works, all of this in an era before social media. Then in the mid-2000s, Web 2.0 is born. And Web 2.0 is another decentralization movement. This time we're decentralizing or democratizing communication. Web 2.0 is commonly referred to as the web of social media. This is when we see all the names that define the current internet landscape pop up. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all these various social media platforms. And the idea here is Web 1.0 decentralized content publishing. I could share anything I wanted with anyone in the world, but that was a one-way conversation. Web 2.0 made the web dynamic and conversational, and now people that I shared content with could share their thoughts and feelings and their works back with me. Think about something like Twitter. All of our politicians and powerful world leaders are for the most part on Twitter and sharing their thoughts. Before Web 2.0 and the birth of social media, if I wanted to say something directly to the President of the United States, I had to go through centralized gatekeepers. I had to find someone who collected messages for the President, and if my message was deemed good enough, it would be passed on to the President. Well, now in the era of Web 2.0 and social media, I can simply go on to Twitter and I can tweet something right at the president. That's no guarantee that he or she will respond or even read what I've shared. But I no longer have to go through that centralized gatekeeper, that authority. So Web 1.0, we decentralize content publishing. Web 2.0, we decentralize communication, and the web becomes two-way. Web 3.0 is all about decentralizing infrastructure. All the components, the underlying hardware that makes the web work. And we're going to explore this idea in later sections as we start to get deeper into this idea of blockchain as shared infrastructure between organizations. But what you'll see is there are a lot of challenges in the world right now where it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to work together in a cooperative fashion, but for you to own the database exclusively, or for me to own the enterprise system exclusively. These are some of the things that Web 3.0 is starting to address. All right, so we know that blockchain is a type of decentralized ledger. Let's talk about how a decentralized ledger works, because it's probably not nearly as complicated as you might think. In fact, we tend to talk about blockchain and these other decentralized technologies as being very new and high tech and cutting edge and presumably very complex. But the truth with blockchain is actually very different. It's not very new at all. It's actually a very unique combination of some of humanity's oldest ideas. And to prove that point, we can go back in the historical record and we can look at the first evidence we've found of human beings using a decentralized ledger. And all of this happened 3,000 years ago on a very small island in the South Pacific called Yap Island. Yap Island is now part of modern-day Micronesia. And 3,000 years ago, the Yapese people used a very unique form of currency. You see, they had coins just like we have coins, and they used their coins just the way we use our coins today, to make purchases, to trade values, to repay debts. The only difference between the coins that the Yapese people used 3,000 years ago and the coins that we use today were their physical size. Our coins are small, mostly made of metal, and you can fit many of them in your pocket at once. The coins that the Yapese used were made of limestones, and they were called ray stones. And you can see a picture of this gentleman standing in front of one. Some of the largest ray stones could be in excess of 12 feet or 4 meters tall and could weigh up to 8,000 pounds or 3,500 kilos. And so this left the Yapese people with a very interesting problem, especially 3,000 years ago. How do you have a functioning economy? How do you have trade and finance and commerce in a world where your money cannot be physically exchanged? Now, this is an idea we largely take for granted today. As time goes on, we tend to use less and less physical money. But all this has only been made possible through massive advancements in computer technology, advancements that did not exist 3,000 years ago. So how did the Yapese solve this very interesting problem? Well, the solution they came up with was very simple but very ingenious. They decided that they would take each of these large ray stones and they would place each one in a different memorable place around the island. So, for example, we might have one stone on the beach and one over by the pond and one at the base of the mountain and maybe one in the middle of the village and so on. And ownership of these stones was maintained on a collective mental ledger. In other words, everybody simply knew in their head which stone belonged to whom. And any time two or more people wished to trade or transact, they would first work out or negotiate the details of the transaction between themselves. And once they had reached agreement, they would announce their transaction to the rest of the tribe, everyone else on the island. So let's consider Alice and Bob. Let's say that we have a stone over by the pond, and that stone belongs to Alice. And everybody on the island collectively mentally knows that that is Alice's stone. Well, Alice has decided that she wants to get into the ranching business, and so one day she strikes up a conversation with Bob, who owns a bunch of livestock. And Alice agrees to purchase 1/2 of Bob's livestock in exchange for the coin over by the pond. Alice and Bob announce this transaction to the rest of the islanders, and from that point on, everybody collectively knows that the stone over by the pond belongs to Bob, not to Alice. Payment could be made and value could be transferred, and no physical exchange was required. So they came up with this very simple but very effective way to solve their problem. And this is, at its simplest form, a decentralized ledger. Now, if we were faced with this same problem today, we would very likely solve it differently. We would very likely take a different approach. And if we were trying to solve this same problem today, rather than taking a decentralized approach, we would probably take a centralized approach, meaning rather than everybody keeping track of who owns which coins or which stones around the island, we would likely appoint a single individual or entity. And we would task this person with maintaining these ownership records or maintaining this ledger. And this single centralized entity that we selected to maintain this data for us, we might call them a bank or a banker. Now, there's some advantages and disadvantages to taking this centralized approach. The advantages of taking this centralized approach, number one, are it's a heck of a lot simpler. If you just have one person responsible for maintaining this ledger, there's just a lot less to coordinate and keep synced up. And this simplicity also results in vastly more efficient processes as well. Think about it. If there's 100 of us on the island, and only one of us has to maintain this ledger, this record of ownership, well, then that means the other 99 of us are free to go do other things, other more economically productive things, or simply more enjoyable things. And that is the first big takeaway I want you to have in the world of blockchain. Blockchain is, by design, a very inefficient approach, and that is okay. We're going to get a little bit deeper into this idea because for many of you, especially if you spent any time working around technology, this is very much the opposite of what you're used to. But as we're talking about the mechanics of blockchain, you are likely to think in the back of your head, hey, isn't all this extremely inefficient? This sounds very inefficient. Am I missing something? And the answer is no, you're not. If all of this sounds remarkably inefficient, that's because it is. And in the world of blockchain and decentralized technologies, we embrace that inefficiency because it results in a number of other benefits. But before we get to that, let's talk about some of the disadvantages of taking a centralized approach. If we take a centralized approach, there are 4 problems that we have to mitigate. And these problems get increasingly more difficult to address as we go. So if we take this centralized approach, we do get the benefits of something that is simpler and vastly more efficient. But we have to make sure of a few things. Number one, we have to make sure whoever we select as our banker is someone we can trust. We have to make sure that person is trustworthy and honest. If we select a banker who is corrupt or susceptible to bribery or corruption, well, then we've made a terrible choice. And that's because in a centralized approach, by definition, there is only one copy of this ledger. And so if someone untrustworthy were to go change what's recorded on the ledger, if that banker were to assign ownership of all the coins on the island to herself or himself, then they would only have to change that record in one place. So we need to make sure whoever we appoint for this very critical position is someone that we can trust. All right, that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is a little bit more difficult to solve, but we can still address it. And that is the banker has to keep the ledger secure. It's not just enough for that banker to be honest and trustworthy. What happens if that banker is honest and trustworthy, but then at the end of the day goes off and decides to go down to the beach and do a little fishing and leaves that ledger on their desk unguarded, unprotected, where anybody else can get to it? We're faced with largely the same problem because there's only that one single copy of the data. If anyone changes it, they've changed our recorded truth. I certainly don't advocate this. It would be unquestionably illegal, complicated, and very risky. But imagine if you hacked into the local systems that your bank keeps, if you found the ledger that your bank kept of all its customers. You could have a very good day simply by locating your account and adding a few zeros to the balance. You wouldn't have to go change that record anywhere else because it doesn't exist anywhere else. All right, so let's say that we have found a banker we can trust. We've done a lot of interviewing and background checks, and we've got a good, trustworthy bank keeper, and we make sure that the ledger is protected. Anytime our banker isn't working with it, we keep it locked up in a safe with guards outside at all times. Well, that brings us to problem number 3, which is our banker needs to be highly available. If our banker isn't online, if our banker isn't available to update the ledger, we really can't have any transactions. And this is an inconvenience I'm sure we've all felt in the modern day life. You go to conduct a little bit of business on a weekend or a holiday. Maybe you're selling an appliance or a used car, but your transaction isn't officially complete until the start of the business week when the local bank opens. In other words, if the bank is offline, your transactions have to wait. And this can be problematic because the banker we appoint is a human being, which means that he or she periodically is going to want to eat or sleep or take some time off. They might get sick and need some time to get better. But we need that banker to be available as much as possible. All right, so we've got a banker we can trust. Problem number 1 is solved. We keep the ledger very secure and guarded at all times. Problem number 2 is solved. Our banker is some kind of superhuman who never eats or sleeps or takes a day off or gets tired. So we've solved number 3. Well, that gets us to problem number 4. And this is the one that there really is no good way to mitigate. And that is, we must do everything we can to prevent the banker from making accidental, inadvertent mistakes. And because our banker is a human being, there really is no way to do this. We are all subject to this. We all, at some point in our life, have made an accidental, completely inadvertent mistake. We weren't trying to be dishonest. We weren't trying to cheat anyone or game the system. We meant to type in a 4 and we accidentally hit a 7. It happens. So if we take this centralized approach, just to recap, we get the benefits of simplicity and efficiency, but we have some pretty tricky problems to solve. We have to make sure our central authority can be trusted, that they're keeping the ledger secure, that they're very highly available, and that they're accurate, or in an ideal world, that they're perfect and make no mistakes. Now let's think about each of these 4 problems in the decentralized approach that they took on Yap Island. And what you'll see is the severity and impact of these problems is greatly limited in a decentralized approach. So let's say, again, there's 100 of us on Yap Island, and we're all collectively maintaining our own copy of the ledger. Well, if one of us or a few of us are untrustworthy, so what? It's not such a big deal, right? If I take my copy of the ledger and I change it so it says that I own every single stone on the island, so what? There's going to be 99 other copies of that ledger that tell a very different story. And when it comes time to determine what the truth is, we're going to see that my version is just an outlier and should be ignored. All right, problem number 2. If all of us are keeping a copy of the ledger and I don't keep mine secure, and you get my copy and you change my copy to say that you own all the stones, well, that's not such a big problem either, is it? Because we're still going to have 98 other copies of the ledger which tell a very, very different story. Problem number 3, if someone's not available, if they're not online, if we have members of the group who are sick or offline or on holiday or sleeping or getting a bite to eat, well, that's no big deal. As long as some of us are still online and able to update our ledgers, we can just get everyone else synced up when they come back online. They can just copy down the information they missed from the rest of us. So we have a solution that is very highly available. And number 4 is perhaps the most interesting one, inadvertent human mistakes. You'll remember this is the one in a centralized approach we really had no good way to mitigate. Well, in a decentralized approach, this concern entirely goes away because on a sufficiently large network, the odds of any of us, the majority of us, 51% or more of us making exactly the same completely accidental mistake at exactly the same time gets so close to 0% is really makes no difference. So if we're willing to sacrifice some of the simplicity and efficiency of a centralized approach, we can diminish the impact of these 4 big concerns. Now, like I said, this stance on efficiency may seem very, very strange, especially if you come from a background in technology. If you've worked in the enterprise side of IT, all of this probably feels very, very weird. Because for the past few decades, what we've been told is that the value of technology, especially in the enterprise space, is it helps us become more efficient. And so as technologists, we have been conditioned to think of inefficiency as our enemy, as our arch rival. And our role as technologists in the world around us is to go out and ruthlessly hunt down inefficiency and to use technology to purge it everywhere we find it. And so we've had this long-standing war with inefficiency. And now, out of nowhere, comes Web 3.0 and this idea of decentralization. And now all of a sudden we're asked to put our arms down and to turn around and to embrace inefficiency. Our long-standing enemy is now our friend. And like I said, all of this sounds very, very weird, but by embracing an inefficient approach, we get some very unique benefits. Things like redundancy, failover, fault tolerance, reliability, accuracy, immutability, ideas that we'll explore deeper in future sections. But just to repeat what I said, you are likely throughout this course going to hear points where you think to yourself, am I really hearing this right? That sounds very inefficient. Well, if you have those thoughts, you're not wrong. Blockchain and decentralized technologies are inefficient by design, and that's okay. And a lot of understanding blockchain is just understanding a new set of lenses to look at the world through. And the first big step is letting go of this idea that inefficiency is somehow a bad thing. All right, well, if we're going to spend the rest of our time together talking about blockchain, we should probably get on the same page with our definitions and talk about what is a block and how are these blocks chained together. So let's start off talking about a block. And probably the best analogy you can use to think about a block is a piece of paper, a digital piece of paper. Both a block and a piece of paper can record any type of information. Whatever type of information you want to record, you are only limited by the amount of paper that you have or the amount of blocks you can fit on a storage device. Now, in both cases, there may be some types of data that make more sense to store either on paper or on chain than others. And a little bit later, we'll explore what some of those differences might be. But understand at this point, there's no technical limitation to either. I can store any type of information I want, either on paper or on a blockchain. And just like on a piece of paper, the information I record on chain does not necessarily have to have any relationship to the other pieces of information I record on chain. Imagine a piece of paper where I've got some voting results information, and below that I've got some sports scores, and below that I've got some weather forecast data, and below that I've got a personal shopping list of items I need to pick up on the way home. None of this information has anything to do with any of the other information. The voting results have absolutely no relation or correlation or relationship to the sports scores, which have no relationship or correlation to the weather data or my personal shopping list. But a piece of paper or a block will happily store these multiple different types of data together seamlessly, because a piece of paper or a block does not have to know or care about the type of information you want to manage in order to function and provide value. So when you think about a block in the blockchain, just think about a digital piece of paper. It's as simple as that. All right, well, what about this chain part? How are we chaining all these blocks or virtual pieces of paper together? Well, all this relies on a little bit of mathematical magic called cryptographic hashing. And a cryptographic hash is a special kind of mathematical function that you can use that will generate a unique output for every unique input. And the idea behind a hash is that no other input will ever generate that particular hash. And this really is just like a thumbprint. Imagine we're looking at a thumbprint, an image of a thumbprint. And all of us are in a room, and we know that that thumbprint belongs to somebody. Well, just by looking at that thumbprint, there is no way that you can determine whose thumb it came from. But if any of us wants to prove that that's our thumbprint, we can do it unequivocally, just because we would be the only one in the room who could reproduce it. We could go up to an ink pad and push our thumb down on it and press it onto a piece of paper and perfectly recreate that thumbprint, thus proving to everybody unequivocally that that original thumbprint was ours. Well, you can think of a hash as just a digital thumbprint. And what we do every time we fill up one of these pages or blocks with data or information that we care about, we take all of that information and we use it to generate one of these thumbprints, one of these hashes. Then, when we start recording transactions or data on the second block or second page in our notebook, the very first thing that we write down is that hash or that thumbprint from page 1. And that hash or thumbprint from page 1 is one of the pieces of input, along with all the rest of the transactions, that will create the thumbprint for page 2, which then gets written to page 3 and so on. And the effect of all this is if I go back to any one of these blocks in the chain and I try to change some data, well, that's going to result in a different thumbprint. And this is going to have a cascading effect from that block or page all the way till the end. And this breaking of links is going to be very obvious and easy to detect for anyone looking in after my attack. And there's a lot more to the mechanics of this, and I can certainly give you some follow-up links if you guys want to dive a little bit deeper when we have some of our open Q&A. But as long as you understand the high-level takeaway, that we use the contents of the previous block on the current block to validate the contents of the current block. And we do this in such a way that if anybody makes any changes, that linking is broken in a cascading fashion. Another important idea to understand in blockchain is that of group consensus. Group consensus is a mechanism relied on by permissionless blockchains, and these permissionless blockchain platforms use group consensus as a way to stay in sync. And a little bit later, we're going to explore the difference between a permissionless and a permissioned blockchain, between open and closed blockchains, private and public blockchains. So if this term permissionless blockchain doesn't mean anything yet, that's okay. We'll clarify that a little bit later. But just understand right now that permissionless blockchains rely on this idea called group consensus, and this is how they stay in sync. And anytime you hear group consensus, you can simply think in your head, majority rules. Whatever the majority of the group agree upon, that's what we're going to assume that the truth is. So if 51% or more of the group align on any set of data, we go ahead and consider that data to be the truth. And if no majority can be formed, well, then we simply discard that current data and start all over again. So let me give you a little example. Let's say that we're all on Yap Island, keeping a mental ledger of coin ownership. And one day, I say, hey, everyone, I've got some big news. This is going to make our life so much easier. Rather than remembering everything mentally, I've got us all notebooks and a pen. And imagine that I give everyone on the island a notebook and a pen. And this notebook is filled with lined sheets of paper, 20 lines per page. And rather than having to remember all of these transactions mentally, we are simply going to start as a group on page 1. And anytime a transaction is announced, we're going to write it on the first line. And when the second transaction gets announced, we write it on the second line. And imagine we're doing this and we're all staying in sync. Well, that means when the 20th transaction is announced, we're going to write it down and we're all going to have a full page. So then we're going to tear that page out of our notebook and we're going to go around and compare it to everybody else's. And what we're trying to see is, do we all have a copy of the same data, or is there any variance in what we have? If 51% or more of us all align around the same set of data, we're going to go ahead and consider that the truth. And if you were one of the ones in the minority, if you had something different on your sheet of paper than what the 51% had, no problem. You're just going to throw your sheet of paper away and you're going to get a copy from someone in the majority. If we go through this exercise and no majority can form, 20% of participants have one copy of the data, 25% have another, 5% have another, 30% have another, 20% have another. Well, then we're going to throw away our sheets of paper collectively and just start over from scratch. This is this idea of group consensus, that we always assume that the truth is whatever the majority of participants align on. All right, so kind of a recap of what I just explained. How does all this work? Well, we have all these nodes on a blockchain network. These are like us, islanders on the island. And all these nodes on the blockchain network record an announcement, just like we would write down a transaction in our notebook. And we're going to go ahead and record these transactions until our block is full and it's ready for validation. When that block is full, all the nodes on the network are going to compare their blocks. And if there's a version of that block data that the majority align on, we're going to go ahead and assume it's the truth. And we're going to seal it to the rest of the chain. All right, let's talk a little bit about blockchain transactions and what a transaction is. And we can start with what makes the most intuitive sense to us. When we hear this word transaction, we usually think of some sort of financial exchange involving two or more parties. And we can model that type of transaction on the blockchain. I call this the onion model of blockchain transactions because we can start at the outer layer with what is most intuitive and familiar to us when we hear this word transaction. And we can peel away layer after layer until we get to the real heart or core of what a blockchain transaction can be. So let's start off with what is most familiar: a multi-party transaction involving some sort of exchange of monetary value. And this is something like a Bitcoin or cryptocurrency transaction. Imagine that you and I make a bet, and I lost the bet. So now I owe you some money. And I ask you, hey, would it be okay if I paid you that debt in Bitcoin? And you said to me, absolutely, that would be just fine. And so in that example, we would be using the Bitcoin ledger to record the fact that at a specific date and time, my wallet was debited a certain amount of Bitcoin and your wallet was credited that amount of Bitcoin. So we have two or more parties coming together in a transaction involving some sort of exchange of monetary value. All right, well, if that makes sense, let's go ahead and peel away that outer layer. And let's talk about transactions where we still have two or more parties involved, but we have no exchange of monetary value. Nothing of financial value is being exchanged. And a good example of this would be a blockchain-based medical record. This is an idea being explored by a lot of startups and entrepreneurs and even large established players in the insurance and medical space. And they are all looking at, is there a way we could safely and securely store patient medical data on a decentralized ledger like a blockchain? Now, certainly there are a lot of privacy and regulatory and security concerns. But the promises are pretty compelling. Imagine if you were traveling halfway across the world and you fell ill, you had to go to the hospital. Wouldn't it be great if you could consent to share your full medical history with the physician that was treating you? Right now, that's virtually impossible to do because of how siloed this information is. So let's fast forward a few years and imagine that we live in a world where all of those security and regulatory and privacy concerns have been addressed, and we can now safely manage our medical records on the blockchain. And imagine you go in for an annual checkup and your doctor looks you over and says, everything looks good. There's just one small thing that's out of whack. And so I want to write you this new prescription to help manage this condition. Well, certainly the fact that you're starting a new prescription is something that should be reflected on your medical record. And if your medical record was kept on the blockchain, that would be a good thing to add to it. Now, of course, this is a non-financial transaction. Nothing of monetary value is being exchanged, but it's still a multi-party transaction. I, as a patient, should not be allowed to go update my own medical record without the involvement of a licensed physician. And similarly, my doctor should not be able to update my medical record without my knowledge or consent. But if both my doctor and I agree that this is a good change or addition to make, well, then we should make it. All right, so we started with two or more parties and an exchange of monetary value. We peeled that down to two or more parties with no exchange of monetary value. Now let's remove that last layer and let's talk about transactions which are just a single party announcement, just a single entity using the ledger to document the fact that some type of interesting or significant event has occurred. Here's an example. Right now, another hot area in the world of blockchain is chain of custody, provenance solutions, helping consumers feel more confident that the items that they're buying are legitimate and genuine. Good example of this is organic produce. Imagine that you're a health conscious consumer and you're going to the grocery store and you're buying produce. Well, how do you know the produce that you're buying is organic? Well, in the US and many other parts of the world, you simply look for a little thumbnail size sticker that indicates that it's organic. Well, as a consumer, maybe you've wondered, how do I know what I'm buying really is organic? How do I know that someone didn't just print up these stickers and put them on the regular produce, and now they're charging me a premium for just the regular produce? Well, in the world of blockchain, we might be able to create a blockchain-based app for a smartphone that could help alleviate some of those concerns. Imagine going to the store and shopping for produce, and rather than looking for a sticker, being able to pull out your phone, and with your phone, being able to scan a barcode or a QR code. And as soon as you scan that code, right there on the home screen of your phone, you can see a history of that item. So if you were shopping for organic apples, you might see right there on your phone the date and time that the trees were planted on the orchard that the apples were harvested from. And you might see a later date and time where those apples were harvested. After that, you might see the date and time where the shipping company picked the apples up from the orchard and when they were delivered to your local store. And you might even be able to see when your produce manager put those apples out on the store shelves for consumers to come and purchase. Well, if you think about all of the data points being recorded on the blockchain, these data points are nothing more than a single party in this supply chain making an announcement that some type of significant or interesting event has happened. It starts off with that farmer saying, "Hey everyone, I just planted some trees that we are later going to take a crop of apples from." And then later, when it's time to harvest those apples, it's that same farmer announcing, "Hey everyone, I just want to let you know we've just harvested these apples." When the logistics company comes and picks up a truckload of those apples, that's another announcement being recorded on the blockchain by a single entity. It's that logistics company saying, "Hey everyone, I just want to let you know I've picked up these apples from the farmer, and now I've dropped them off to the local market." And at the end of it, it's another single party, the produce manager, using the blockchain to document the fact that they've put those apples out on the store shelf and they're now ready for you to come in and buy. And each of these transactions is nothing more than one of these single parties announcing that some type of interesting event has happened in that supply chain. Now it really gets interesting, and we can bring in the idea of smart contracts. And before we talk about smart contracts, I just want to start off by saying, if this is a new term to you, ignore the word contract. This is an unfortunate naming convention that's been adopted in blockchain because for many of us, when we hear this word contract, we think of something very specific. We think of a legally binding agreement between two or more parties. But when we talk about a smart contract on the blockchain, we're just talking about some computer code. And there may or may not be anything legally binding about that computer code. So please do not read too much into this word contract. Like I said, it's just an unfortunate choice in naming that we've made in the blockchain world. But the idea behind a smart contract is I can go ahead and write some computer code. And this code can be executed or invoked in response to an announcement that gets recorded on the ledger. So let's think about the example we just talked about with our fresh organic apples. Let's say that at my local grocery store, those fresh organic apples are very popular, and they always sell out within the first day of being put on the store shelf. So imagine that this application on my smartphone has the ability to deliver alerts, and I sign up for an alert. I want to get a text message or an email anytime my produce manager puts a new load of organic apples out on the store shelves for customers to come buy. Well, that means anytime that transaction gets recorded on the blockchain, I'm going to need some computer code to send that text message to my phone or to generate that email and send it to me. So a smart contract gives us a way to write some of this code, to develop some of this logic, and to have this logic executed or invoked in response to something being recorded on the ledger. Now, if you put together all the pieces that I'm talking about, we have a way to record significant events, and then we can programmatically respond to those significant or interesting events. You might think, hey, he's describing something familiar. That sounds an awful lot like a workflow solution, or a business process automation or process management solution. And if you're thinking that, you are 100% correct. One of the ways that you can view blockchain is as a workflow engine, a BPA or process management solution. What's the difference between blockchain and traditional workflow? Traditional workflow is owned and maintained and controlled exclusively by one organization. Blockchain can be thought of as a workflow engine where the infrastructure is collectively shared between organizations. We'll explore this idea a lot deeper in an upcoming section on use cases. But this is just one way you can start to think about blockchain and some of the value that the technology can provide. All right, that brings us to the end of this section. Hopefully by now you're feeling a little bit more confident on what blockchain is and how it works. If the story of what happened on Yap Island 3,000 years ago makes sense, congratulations, you are well on your way to becoming a blockchain expert. Everything else beyond that simple story is just additional detail. All of the big concepts are contained within it. So if that little story made sense, and especially if you feel like you can turn around and share that story with someone else, you are well prepared to be successful in the blockchain world. In the next section, we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into blockchain. We're going to talk about the history of blockchain. How did we get to the point that we're at today? We'll talk about the different types of blockchain. What's the difference between a permissioned and a permissionless platform? What do the terms private and public mean when we're talking about blockchains? And then we'll look at blockchain in the enterprise space. Much of the attention right now in the blockchain world has gone to the consumer side of things. But that is rapidly shifting. And some of the world's largest and most powerful organizations are starting to take a very serious look at this technology and using it to reshape the world around us in fairly profound ways. So we'll explore some of the differences between blockchain use on the consumer side and the enterprise side. And this will set the stage for the section after this, where we'll start to talk about use cases and where we can actually apply the technology. So lots of exciting stuff coming up.